user story mapping. So this is a user story map, and it's a way of organizing your user stories, your backlog, the work that your team are going to do into functional areas, user journeys across the top, and tasks that make up each of the different steps along the user journey. And I think it's better than a backlog, and the reason why is because it helps you to focus on what the actual user goals are and visualize that, but it also enforces some kind of collaboration between the team and understanding what this, all the different stories on your backlog represent, why you're doing them, and what they help your users to do. And you can build them with Post-its or you can build them with software, but I thoroughly recommend building them with Post-its and building them with a team. And the reason why I think it's important to learn about user story mapping is if you go back about and look at what user stories are actually for and why they exist, Mike Cohen, who wrote the book on user stories, will tell you that user stories shift the focus from written requirements documents to conversations between the customer and the developers. And Kent Beck, who was the guy who came up with user stories in the first place, says that user stories get their name from how you're meant to use them, not really how you're meant to write them. And they're not a way to generate a perfect requirements document. And if your objective is to learn how to write the ultimate user story that's totally unambiguous in every detail that you can then hand off to your team, then you probably missed the point and you're doing it wrong. And here's a story about why. So on the 25th of October in 1854, this guy, who was Lord Raglan, was on the battlefield looking down across the battlefield. And he could see in the distance some Russian troops had captured some British guns from the British Allies. And he was determined that the Russians weren't going to recover those guns and drag them back to Sebastopol because he knew that would be a huge propaganda victory for the Russian forces over the British. And so he issued an instruction. This is the instruction. Lord Raglan wishes the cavalry to advance rapidly to the front and try to prevent the enemy from carrying away guns. Troops of horse artillery may accompany. French artillery is on your left. Immediate. And this was written down by Raglan's assistant. He wasn't the kind of man who wrote his own messages. And they handed it to Captain Nolan, who was the fastest horseman in the British Army, who carried the written message down to the cavalry officers in the valley. As it happens, these two were related, they were brother-in-law, and they hated each other. And when they received their orders, they turned to Lord Nolan, Captain Nolan, and they said, "Attack the guns, sir. Which guns, sir? Why?" And Lord Nolan turned back to them, and he gesticulated vaguely up the valley and said, "Those are your guns, sir. Attack." And so they did. Now, Lord Raglan was about here, and the guns that the Russians were trying to capture were here. But the cavalry were here. And they couldn't see over this hill to the guns they were meant to capture. The only guns they could see were here, at the far end of the valley. And there were a lot of them. There was an artillery battalion. And there was further artillery to the north and to the south. And did you know what they did? They galloped the 2 kilometers down the valley towards the Russian battalion. 120 men died, far more were injured, and it went down in history as one of the most famous incidents in the history of the British Army. So as a little story that helps us understand that poorly expressed requirements, handoff, miscommunication, and especially assumptions can lead to mistakes and waste. Here's another story about that. If you're old enough, you might remember that the Mars Climate Orbiter flew all the way to Mars, and instead of establishing an orbit around Mars, it burnt up in the atmosphere. Upon investigating the cause of this issue, one of the causes was determined that the ground control software, which issued the instructions to the thrusters, used imperial units, and the software on the Mars orbiter was expecting metric units. But there was another reason why this was allowed to happen, because earlier in the week, some of the navigators had spotted that something wasn't wrong. They said that they didn't think the orbiter was going in quite the right direction, and they said it didn't think it was where it said it was. And they had a meeting and they discussed it and they worked out what they were going to do, but they didn't use the right form to express their concerns, and so their concerns were not followed up. And that cost $125 million. So back to user stories. The 3 C's of user stories are the card, which is a placeholder for the confirmation. the conversation, and the confirmation, which is how you understand that your user story has been delivered. And there's two ways you can use user story mapping. Both of them are quite important. And one of them helps you understand how do your users currently achieve this goal. And the second use is how could your product help your users achieve this goal. And if you're going to run a user story mapping exercise, you're going to need a big wall, loads of post-its, lots of pens, some builder's tape, a team, your product owner, users if you can get hold of some, any relevant stakeholders, and very importantly a camera, and probably a few hours. And the best way to run a user story mapping workshop is to get everybody in the room to participate and get them to map out a goal that everybody present can relate to. So our goal is come to Headtalks and watch Barney's presentation. And the way that we'll do this is, I would get you all down the front and give you post-its, but we're not going to do that because I've only got a few minutes. Everybody gets their post-it notes. Write down on your post-it notes the tasks that you carried out this morning in the run-up to attending Barney's presentation. And we give everybody a few minutes to do that, and we put them down in the middle of the table. These are mine. So I woke up, went to the loo, got dressed, ate breakfast, cleaned my teeth, went to work, went to stand-up, did some work, didn't actually do any pair programming. I was preparing my talk. Walked to the breakout room, stood in the queue, chose my lunch, chose a drink, went downstairs, chose a seat, ate my lunch, watched Barney's presentation. Maybe I asked an insightful question in the Q&A afterwards. Everybody else contributes their tasks as well. We can lay those out on the table in front of us and we get an idea about how everybody else got here, what everybody else had to do in order to achieve this goal of watching Barney's presentation. We can group those different tasks together. In this case, they're just mine, but if you get everybody else's together, then you can start to form the steps of the journey that people took. And the high level, it was get up, eat, go to work, do some work, go to OP, have lunch, watch presentation. Organise our tasks into the different steps of the user journey, and now, already, before we've even finished, we've got some context around why do I have this story? What is it actually helping the user do? Which is really useful. Furthermore, within each of the different steps, you can prioritise the different tasks as to how critical they are in order to help you achieve that step. Add in extra steps that you've missed. I had to help my daughter with her homework and get the other one to actually put some clothes on this morning. You can think about other steps that other types of users might have to have taken to achieve the same goal. So maybe some of you have a dog that needs walking before you can go to work, or you have to go to do some exercise or take the kids to school. You can think about other ways that different users might accomplish the same step. So I drove, maybe some of you walked, some of you might have cycled. And then maybe there are things that you ought to add into your backlog to cater for when stuff goes wrong. If you're cycling to work, perhaps you have to pump your tyres before you can set off. Or maybe you drove to work and you had to stop and buy fuel. So now we've got a pretty comprehensive backlog of stories in 2 dimensions that help us build some functionality for our users to get to Barney's presentation, but there's way too much of it. So if we pull down the stories that aren't necessarily critical to achieving the goal, we don't throw them away, we just move them down the map. Maybe you don't need to have any lunch before you come to watch our presentations. Maybe you don't need to have any breakfast either. And if you're running really late, maybe you don't even need to clean your teeth before you leave the house or watch my presentation. Perhaps you don't even need to do any work before you come to Headtalks. So now we've built a release, which is version 1, release 1, our MVP of Attend Barney's presentation, and it only contains really the tasks that were absolutely critical to getting there. And you could build this, you could put this piece of software in front of your users, and they might not like it because they didn't get any lunch and their teeth aren't clean and they didn't get any breakfast, but they can see how it helps them achieve their goal, and they can give you some feedback on where it was lacking and what else it needs. And of course you can follow that up with a second release, which includes some more of the functionality that your users might want, that makes it maybe a bit more useful and relevant to them. But moving post-its around and positioning them nicely, although it's useful and gives you a bit of context, isn't really the point. The point is that everybody in your team had this conversation with all of your stakeholders. And if you had users, they were there too. And the people who were moving the post-its around on the board wasn't just the product manager, it wasn't just a stakeholder from on high telling you this is what needs to be done. You talked about these post-its with your users and you understood why this one up here is higher up than this one down here, and why there's nothing underneath this one at the moment, because maybe there's no tasks that are that important. And when you go back to do that work, everybody has a much clearer understanding, not only of what the work is that they're trying to do, and what the acceptance criteria are, but why the user needs that piece of functionality, what it helps them accomplish, because they were there having that conversation. So the other important thing, once you've done this, especially if you've done it with loads of post-its on the wall, is to take pictures of your story map, to take back with you, to document it. You could take all those stories and transcribe them into Jira or VSTS or some other tool, like the one that I showed earlier on. But it's really important to have the photographs that you took. And then here's a story about why. So this is my user story. If I gave this to someone and asked you to recreate this, you might possibly end up rebuilding a scene with a man handing another man a cup of tea, and you might notice that that's me, and you might go, okay, so we need to get Mike to give somebody else a cup of tea. But if you were there, and you actually took part in this, then you'll know that that's my dad, this is my wedding, this cup of tea is part of a Chinese tea ceremony. My wife's cousin stood up and explained to everyone the symbolism and the relevance of why we're doing this, and you'll probably know that this is a particular type of green tea. You can't see it in the photo, but there's a particular ring that I'm wearing, and there's a date in that cup. And you wouldn't know any of that if I just gave you the picture, but if you were there, then hopefully this picture would remind you about that whole conversation and what was important, and it wasn't just a picture about giving somebody a cup of tea. So go to user story mapping, get as much information in here as possible, take photographs of what you did. And when you come back to look at these things later on, you'll know that these green post-its that you put in were for one type of user, the blue ones were for a different type of user. You'll remember that the red ones were the ones where you thought there was a particular challenge or there was a bug or something like that. And maybe there's some other color coding that you decide when you're doing this. But the visual representation is like your holiday photos. They mean a lot more to you maybe than to anybody else, but they're a lot more insightful and a lot richer than if you just stick your requirements in Jira. That's me. Buy this book by Jeff Patton. It's the best book on product management that I've read, and I buy lots of them. And now you can listen to Barney's presentation.